Some secrets damage a marriage. Others can destroy it beyond repair. This week in Salem, one impossible choice, one buried truth, and one love from the past are colliding in a way that could leave a marriage shattered. Because when hope rises from the dead, it does not come back gently. It brings fear, guilt, confusion, and emotional chaos with it. And that is exactly why this storyline feels so dangerous. What looks like a miracle on the surface may actually be the beginning of heartbreak. Because the real question is no longer just who survives. It is who gets hurt the most when the truth finally comes out. What makes this storyline so powerful is that the damage may have started the very moment the decision was made. On the surface, allowing the experiment to continue feels compassionate. It feels like an act of faith. It feels like choosing hope over fear. And emotionally, that is easy to understand. If there is even the smallest chance to bring someone back, stopping it would feel almost cruel. But that is exactly why this choice is so dangerous. The moment Paulina stepped aside and allowed this to move forward, she put herself in the middle of a situation where every outcome comes with pain. If the experiment fails, then she will have helped create false hope and opened the door to even more heartbreak. But if it works, the consequences may be even harder to survive. Because success would not simply mean that someone opens their eyes. It would mean that the past suddenly becomes real again. A love that was buried comes back to life. A history that everyone thought was over suddenly has a future again. And that is where this story stops being about science and starts becoming emotional warfare. That is the real danger here. A miracle does not arrive neatly. It arrives with fallout. You can almost picture the scene already. A tense room. Machines humming. Nobody speaking. Then the smallest movement. A hand shifts. Eyes slowly open. Someone whispers, almost in disbelief, "Oh my God." That is the kind of moment that changes every relationship around it. Because once that happens, nobody gets to stay where they were before. The marriage, the family, the emotional balance, all of it gets shaken instantly. And for Paulina, the terrifying part is that she may have helped set that entire chain reaction in motion herself. As dramatic as the resurrection angle is, the bigger threat to this marriage may actually be the secret surrounding it. Because hope can be forgiven. Silence is harder to forgive. Keeping something this enormous from Abe was always risky. Keeping Theo in the dark as well makes it even worse. Yes, there is a logical reason for the silence. Nobody wants to give a family hope too early. Nobody wants to announce a miracle before there is certainty. That part makes sense. But the problem is that secrecy changes meaning over time. At first, it may look like protection. Later, it looks like deception. And once Abe finds out that this truth was kept from him, his reaction may not begin with gratitude. It may begin with hurt. It may begin with anger. It may begin with that awful feeling that everyone else was standing inside a life-changing moment while he was left outside the door. That is what makes this so emotionally dangerous. Because Abe may not just ask what happened. He may ask why his wife decided he could not handle the truth. He may feel humiliated that such a major decision was made without him. He may feel shut out of his own family's emotional reality. That is how trust starts breaking down. You can imagine the confrontation clearly. Abe stares at Paulina, stunned, struggling to process the truth, and then says in a low, wounded voice, "You knew, and you said nothing?" That line would hit hard because it gets to the heart of the issue. This is not just about a secret. It is about being denied the right to know something that could change his entire world. And once that crack appears, bigger questions follow. What else has she hidden? What other choices has she made on his behalf? How can he trust her judgment after this? That is why the silence may end up doing more damage than the truth itself. Not because Paulina meant to betray him, but because even good intentions can still leave a marriage badly wounded. But even if the secret is exposed and the anger settles, Paulina may still be facing an even more painful reality. Abe will always have a place in his heart for Lexi. And that is not a small issue. That is the emotional center of the entire storyline. Because this is not about a random ex from the past. This is about a love that mattered deeply, a bond that shaped Abe's life, and a woman connected to some of his most important memories. Even if he loves Paulina, even if his marriage is real and meaningful, that history with Lexi does not just disappear. It stays there, and if Lexi truly comes back, those feelings may rise faster than anyone is prepared for. That is what makes this so tragic for Paulina. She may not lose Abe through one dramatic choice. She may lose him little by little, through moments she cannot fight. A look that lasts too long. A softer tone in his voice. A silence filled with emotion. A connection that becomes obvious before anyone says it out loud. That kind of heartbreak is often worse than a direct betrayal, because it happens right in front of you while you can do nothing to stop it. Imagine Abe seeing Lexi awake, truly awake, and standing there in disbelief. His face changes. His voice shakes. Maybe he steps closer and says, "I never thought I'd see you again." That is the kind of moment Paulina would immediately understand. Not because Abe is trying to hurt her. Not because Lexi is plotting anything. But because some emotional bonds are so deep that the past can still overpower the present. And that is the real fear here. Paulina may be forced to watch the man she loves reconnect with a part of himself that never fully let go. If that happens, the threat to her marriage will not come from lies anymore. It will come from something far more difficult to defeat: love that was never truly finished. If we step back and look at this purely from a storytelling angle, the most worrying possibility becomes very clear. The show may be setting up a temporary pull between Abe and Lexi. And from a soap perspective, that makes perfect sense. Because the most dramatic version of this story is not Abe immediately reassuring Paulina and shutting down every emotional complication. The most dramatic version is Abe feeling torn. It is Abe trying to do the right thing while clearly being affected by Lexi's return. It is Abe telling himself that he is only being supportive, only being compassionate, only trying to understand this impossible situation, while emotionally drifting closer and closer to the woman he once loved so deeply. That is where Paulina's real nightmare begins. Because then she is no longer dealing with one shocking secret or one painful reveal. She is dealing with a living reminder that the man she loves once had another great love, and that love is now standing right in front of him again. That is exactly the kind of emotional irony soaps thrive on. Paulina may become the woman who made the moral choice, supported the impossible, and tried to do what was right, only to discover that her own generosity helped create the threat to her marriage. That is tragic in the most classic soap opera way. And the heartbreak may not come through one giant betrayal. It may come through smaller moments that slowly become impossible to ignore. Abe checking on Lexi more often than necessary. A conversation that lasts too long. A look that lingers. A smile that feels too intimate. A memory shared in a tone that makes Paulina feel like she is standing outside something she cannot enter. That is what would make this story hit so hard. Not loud chaos for the sake of drama, but quiet devastation. The kind that builds scene by scene until one person finally realizes the emotional distance in the marriage is no longer temporary. You can imagine Paulina trying to stay composed, trying to be fair, trying not to sound jealous of a woman who has just come back from the dead. But eventually, the pain would rise to the surface. Maybe she looks at Abe with tears in her eyes and says, "Tell me the truth. Are you going back to her?" That kind of confrontation would say everything. Because once that question is asked, the marriage is already in crisis. And if Abe cannot answer clearly, or worse, if his silence becomes the answer, then Paulina's fear becomes real. At that point, this is no longer emotional confusion. It becomes a full collapse in trust, security, and connection. Separate rooms. Cold tension. Conversations cut short. A wedding ring slipped off in frustration. A marriage still technically alive, but emotionally starting to break apart. That is when divorce stops sounding extreme and starts sounding possible. So now we get to the biggest question of all. Is Paulina truly losing Abe? The most honest answer is, she may be, at least for a while. And that is what makes this storyline so effective. Because the danger here is not just that Abe could make one dramatic choice and walk away. The danger is that Paulina may have to live through something even harder. The slow, painful feeling that her husband is emotionally slipping out of her reach before she can stop it. That kind of uncertainty can be worse than a clean breakup. At least with a breakup, the pain is direct. It is brutal, but clear. What Paulina may be facing instead is the agony of not knowing. Not knowing whether Abe is simply overwhelmed or genuinely being pulled back toward Lexi. Not knowing whether this is a temporary emotional storm or the beginning of the end of her marriage. Not knowing whether every quiet moment between Abe and Lexi means something, or whether she is just watching her own worst fear come true in slow motion. That is a much darker kind of suspense. And from a long-term soap perspective, it does not necessarily mean Paulina and Abe are finished forever. In fact, they could still very well be the ultimate endgame. Soap couples are separated all the time so the story can test them, wound them, and then eventually rebuild them. But that does not make this part any less painful. Because before any reunion can feel satisfying, the loss has to feel real. The audience has to believe that Paulina could actually lose him. Paulina herself has to feel that loss in a deep and frightening way. She has to question whether doing the right thing has cost her everything. She has to wonder whether she opened the door to a miracle for someone else while creating a disaster for herself. That is why this story has such strong emotional weight. It is not just asking whether Lexi survives. It is asking what that survival does to everyone around her. A miracle may be unfolding in Salem, but miracles in soap operas are never simple. They come with emotional consequences. They revive love, regret, guilt, memory, and unfinished business all at once. And for Paulina, that may feel less like hope and more like catastrophe. So no, she may not lose Abe forever. But she could absolutely lose her sense of safety, her trust in where her marriage stands, and the belief that her future with Abe is secure. And sometimes, that kind of loss is the most devastating of all. Because if Abe takes even one step too far toward the past, Paulina may find herself facing a truth she never wanted to imagine. That the greatest threat to her marriage was never a villain or a scheme, but a love story that was never fully over. So what do you think? Is Paulina really watching her marriage fall apart, or is this just the painful middle chapter before Abe finds his way back to her? And if Lexi's return changes everything, will Abe hold on to the life he built in the present, or follow the part of his heart that still belongs to the past?